Imagine fainting in open court, 7 months pregnant, while your husband's mistress smiles for her live stream, confident the DNA will ruin you. Now imagine waking up to learn the test did the opposite, and that it's only the first detonation in a chain of secrets. Poisoned prenatal vitamins, a 5-year-old's hidden recordings, a nurse who paid the price for telling the truth, and a dynasty built on medicine that makes people sick. By the time the judge opens a second envelope, reputations shatter, alliances flip, and one viral confession turns a custody hearing into a federal takedown. Stay with this story to hear how a mother outwits a cartel in couture, how a child's red button breaks a billionaire family, and how the final twist is the one no one in that courtroom saw coming. If justice jaw-drop reveals and Phoenix-level comebacks are your thing, tap like, drop your boldest theory in the comments, share with a friend who loves drama, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything turns. The mahogany benches of Courtroom 7 seemed to close in on Sarah Mitchell as she gripped the defense table, her 7-month pregnancy making every breath a struggle. The air conditioning had failed that morning, and the September heat pressed through the tall windows, turning the formal chamber into a suffocating box of tension and sweat. Across the aisle, her husband Marcus sat with perfect posture despite the heat, his $1,000 suit somehow still immaculate, his expression carved from ice. Behind him in the gallery, Victoria Sterling adjusted her designer dress, a crimson Alexander McQueen piece that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and smiled. Not broadly, but with the subtle satisfaction of a predator watching wounded prey finally succumb. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Patricia Hawthorne's voice cut through the suffocating tension like a blade through silk. The court has received the laboratory results you requested. Before we proceed, are you certain you wish these results read into the public record? Sarah's attorney, Rachel Torres, placed a steadying hand on her client's shoulder. Rachel had known Sarah since their days at Northwestern, had been her maid of honor, had watched this marriage transform from fairy tale to nightmare. Her voice carried both professional authority and personal fury as she responded, "Your Honor, my client has nothing to hide. We request full disclosure." The words seemed to echo in the vast courtroom, bouncing off the oil portraits of former judges who gazed down with stern disapproval. Sarah caught Marcus's eye for just a moment. Those blue eyes that once promised her the world, that had looked at her with tears of joy when Emma was born, now held nothing but contempt and something else. Anticipation. He was enjoying this. Victoria leaned forward, her phone discreetly angled to capture every moment. Her Instagram story was already viral. Justice Day with a scales emoji. 23,000 views and climbing. The comments section was a chorus of support from her followers, women who saw her as an empowerment icon, stealing a man from his boring wife and living her best life. They didn't know about the mercury. They didn't know about the systematic destruction. They only knew the narrative Victoria had carefully crafted. Successful woman claims her destiny. Judge Hawthorne lifted the sealed envelope with deliberate slowness. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, ready to immortalize whatever came next. The bailiff, a former Marine named Robertson who'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs, shifted slightly, his hand moving imperceptibly closer to his radio. He could sense it, that electric moment before violence, before collapse, before everything changes. Sarah's vision began to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing like shadows at a funeral. She could feel the baby kicking, urgent, insistent, as if sensing danger. Her mouth was desert dry despite the water Rachel kept pushing toward her. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Severe nausea, debilitating fatigue, symptoms that made no sense until the private investigator found the contaminated vitamins. But she couldn't prove it. Marcus had been too careful, too smart, too connected. The results of the court-ordered paternity test are as follows, the judge began, her voice steady and clinical, trained through 30 years on the bench to deliver devastating news without emotion. Regarding the unborn child of Sarah Mitchell, the floor tilted, or maybe Sarah tilted. She heard her own voice from far away, a small gasp that might have been no, or might have been nothing at all. Her knees buckled, betraying her at the worst possible moment. proving Marcus's narrative that she was weak, unstable, unfit. She felt Rachel's hands reaching for her, heard someone shout for a medic, sensed the bailiff rushing forward. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Victoria's smile widening, her perfectly glossed lips mouthing a single word that Sarah could read clearly even as consciousness fled. Finally. The impact was cushioned by Rachel's arms, but Sarah's pregnant belly made the fall awkward and terrifying. Someone screamed, maybe the court reporter, maybe someone in the gallery. The baby kicked hard, once, twice, then went still. And in that stillness, in that moment between consciousness and void, Sarah heard Victoria's laugh of light, tinkling, victorious. Everything went black. Sarah Mitchell had built her life on precision. As CEO of NextGen Biotech, she understood that success came from seeing patterns others missed, from understanding systems and finding their weaknesses, which is why the pattern in her smart home data made her blood run cold on that March evening when spring rain drummed against the windows of her home office. The house system showed Marcus's Mercedes in the garage at 2:14 a.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, always the same nights she had her board meetings that ran late, dealing with the new gene therapy trials that could revolutionize cancer treatment. Always when their 5-year-old daughter Emma was asleep, curled up with her stuffed unicorn, dreaming of the birthday party they'd been planning. Always when the bedroom motion sensors showed movement in the master suite, despite Sarah being 20 miles away in a conference room, fighting for funding, building their future. She sat in her home office studying the data on her laptop with the same intensity she once applied to genome sequences. The room around her was her sanctuary, built-in bookshelves holding medical journals and business texts, her diplomas from MIT and Harvard prominently displayed, photos of their family vacation to Disney World, where Marcus had carried Emma on his shoulders for hours. Marcus was supposedly at his pharmaceutical company's headquarters, dealing with a crisis involving FDA approval for their new arthritis drug. Emma was at school, probably painting an art class, getting those tempera paints under her fingernails that would take 3 baths to fully remove. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. Tuesday. Of course it was Tuesday. Sarah pulled up their security footage from the previous Tuesday, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated the familiar interface. She'd never checked before. Why would she? Trust was the foundation of marriage, and she'd trusted Marcus completely. He'd supported her career, celebrated her successes, held her through her failures. When her father died of pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, Marcus had handled everything from funeral arrangements to estate management. Marcus appeared on screen at 2:12 a.m., but he wasn't alone. A blonde woman followed him through their front door, her hand on his lower back with casual intimacy that spoke of routine, of comfort, of countless repetitions. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head thrown back, her designer heels clicking on the marble foyer that Sarah had selected after visiting 12 different quarries. Sarah zoomed in, her heart hammering against her ribs. Victoria Sterling. She recognized her from Marcus's company events, a wellness influencer who'd recently partnered with his pharmaceutical company for a supplement line called Pure Life. 28 years old, with 900,000 Instagram followers and a smile that never reached her calculating eyes. Sarah had actually liked her at the holiday party, had complimented her dress, had made small talk about yoga and clean eating. The video showed them kissing in her foyer, in her home, where her daughter slept upstairs beneath the glow-in-the-dark stars they'd stuck to her ceiling together. His hands tangled in Victoria's hair with a passion Sarah hadn't seen in 2 years. They moved toward the stairs, toward the bedroom where Sarah had labored for 18 hours to bring Emma into the world, where they'd made love on their wedding night, where she thought their second child had been conceived. Sarah's hands shook as she clicked through more dates. Week after week, the same pattern. Sometimes they didn't even make it to the bedroom, coupling frantically on the Italian leather sofa Sarah had picked out for their anniversary, the one where Emma loved to build pillow forts. Once, the cameras caught them in the kitchen, Victoria perched on the granite countertop where Sarah prepared Emma's school lunches every morning. She was still staring at the screen, nausea rising in her throat, when her phone rang. Dr. Harrison's office. Mrs. Mitchell, congratulations. Your pregnancy test came back positive. You're about 6 weeks along. We'll want to see you soon to start prenatal vitamins and schedule your first ultrasound. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. She and Marcus had tried for 2 years for a second child. Fertility treatments, temperature charts, scheduled intimacy that had drained all romance from their relationship. Now, finally pregnant, she was watching her marriage crumble in high definition. Every betrayal captured in 4K resolution. 2 weeks passed in surreal normalcy that felt like walking through a minefield while pretending to pick flowers. Sarah documented everything with the methodical precision of a scientist gathering data. Screenshots saved to 3 different cloud services, videos backed up on external drives hidden in her office, financial records showing mysterious withdrawals that corresponded with charges at high-end restaurants and hotels she'd never visited. She hired Michael Brooks, a private investigator recommended by a divorced friend from her book club, paying him from her personal account that Marcus didn't monitor, the one she'd kept from before marriage just in case. Though she'd never imagined this case. Brooks was a former FBI agent who'd left the bureau after exposing corruption in his department, a man whose moral compass pointed true north even when it cost him everything. He worked out of a small office above a Vietnamese restaurant, the air always smelling of pho and possibility. What he uncovered in just 10 days made the affair seem like a paper cut compared to the amputation Marcus was planning. He's been moving money for 8 months, Brooks told her in a Starbucks parking lot, passing her a folder through her car window while rain pelted the windshield. The folder was thick, held together with rubber bands, every page another betrayal documented in black and white. Shell companies in Delaware, offshore accounts in the Caymans, a trust in Switzerland, all leading back to Victoria Sterling. But Sarah, that's not the worst part. Sarah's morning sickness rose in her throat, though she couldn't tell if it was the pregnancy or the devastating revelations. What could be worse than him stealing our money to fund his mistress's lifestyle? Your company. He's been accessing your corporate accounts using your passwords, the ones you saved on your shared home computer. There are transfers that look like embezzlement, all with your digital signature, all traceable to your login credentials. The amounts are staggering. $2.3 million moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags, but large enough to constitute grand larceny. The folder contained printouts that made no sense until they made horrible sense. Marcus had been setting her up, creating a paper trail that would destroy her professionally and personally. The transfers coincided with days she'd been sick, exhausted from the early pregnancy she hadn't yet announced, working from home where he had access to her laptop while she slept off the crushing fatigue. There's more, Brooks said quietly, his weathered face grim. Your prenatal vitamins. I had them tested at an independent lab, paid cash, kept it off the books. He handed her a laboratory report with numbers that swam before her eyes until one line came into sharp focus. Mercury levels 6 times the safe limit. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to cause symptoms that mimicked severe morning sickness. Enough to make her weak, confused, compliant. Enough to potentially damage the baby, though she couldn't bear to think about that possibility. He's poisoning you, Sarah. Slowly, carefully, with just enough to make you sick, but not enough to trigger a standard toxicology screen. It's brilliant in its evil. Everyone expects pregnant women to be tired and nauseous. Sarah drove home in a daze, the windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched her racing heart. Marcus was in his study when she arrived. Emma at her grandmother's for the weekend. Marcus's mother, a cold woman who'd never approved of Sarah, who thought her son had married beneath his station. She stood in his doorway, watching him work on his laptop, probably moving more money, planning more destruction. This stranger wearing her husband's face, using the hands that had once held her tenderly to type commands that would destroy her. I'm pregnant, she said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. He looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she saw something flicker. Surprise, perhaps even joy, a ghost of the man who'd cried when Emma was born. Then his face shuddered, becoming the mask she now realized he'd worn for months, maybe years. That's unexpected, he said carefully, closing his laptop with deliberate slowness. We haven't been intimate in 6 weeks. The accusation hung there, unspoken but clear. Sarah pulled out her phone, showed him a screenshot of Victoria entering their house, time-stamped and damning. Seems like you've been pretty busy with your own projects. The mask dropped entirely. Marcus stood slowly, his 6'3" frame filling the doorway as he approached her. No denial, no apology, no attempt at explanation, just cold calculation in every step. She could see him thinking, planning, adjusting his strategy in real time. You went through my security system, he said, voice dangerously low, the tone he used in board meetings when destroying a competitor. My security system, Sarah corrected, standing her ground even as her knees trembled. My house, my company that paid for it, my life you're destroying. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise. Marcus was too smart for that, too careful about evidence, but firm enough to communicate threat, to remind her that he was stronger, larger, more connected. Careful, Sarah. Pregnancy makes women emotional, irrational, paranoid. Everyone knows that. Who would believe a hormonal woman making wild accusations against her successful, devoted husband? I have 50 character witnesses who will testify what a loving family man I am. Let go of me. He did, stepping back with a shrug that somehow conveyed more menace than any threat could. I'll be moving to the guest room. For the baby's health, of course. Stress isn't good for pregnancy. We wouldn't want anything to happen to our child, would we? That night, Sarah heard him on the phone through the thin walls, voice carrying with deliberate clarity. Move the timeline up. She knows. Yes, all of it. Make the deposits tomorrow. I want her arrested by Friday. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in Emma's room watching her daughter dream, memorizing every detail of her peaceful face. She called Brooks, whispered the urgency, made copies of everything, hid USB drives in Emma's stuffed animals, uploaded files to servers in 3 countries. She knew what was coming. 3 days later, she was arrested at her office in front of 43 employees and 2 news crews that somehow knew to be there. The charges: embezzlement and possession of cocaine found in her car, 2 kilos hidden in the spare tire compartment she'd never opened. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her assistant Jennifer crying in the background. Her entire team watching in shock, Sarah saw Marcus's Mercedes across the street. Victoria was in the passenger seat, phone raised, recording everything, broadcasting live to nearly 1 million followers. The caption read, "When karma comes for those who deserve it, truth always wins." The interrogation room at the police station smelled like burnt coffee and desperation, the fluorescent lights buzzing with hostile intensity. Sarah's court-appointed lawyer was 26, fresh from law school, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case and clearly skeptical of her claims. The cocaine was planted, Sarah insisted for the 100th time, her voice hoarse from repetition. Check the security footage from the parking garage. Check when that compartment was last accessed. There is no footage, the young lawyer stammered, shuffling through papers with nervous hands. System malfunction from Monday through Thursday. The entire week's recordings are corrupted. Of course they were. Marcus had thought of everything. The young lawyer, whose name badge read Thomas Carter, looked at her with a mixture of pity and doubt. Mrs. Mitchell, 2 kilos of cocaine. That's serious trafficking weight. The prosecution is talking about 20 years minimum. Maybe we should consider a plea deal. I'm innocent, Sarah said, the words feeling hollow even though they were true. Truth didn't matter in Marcus's world, only perception, and he controlled that narrative completely. Rachel Torres arrived like cavalry at dawn, Sarah's college roommate, now a successful defense attorney, taking the case pro bono out of fury and friendship. She swept into the precinct wearing a power suit and radiating competence, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere. This is coordinated destruction, Rachel said after reviewing everything, her legal mind processing the patterns. But we can fight this. I've seen this playbook before. Successful men destroying their wives through the system. We'll need to be smarter, faster, and absolutely ruthless. But the machinery of destruction was already in motion. The board of Next Gen Biotech didn't wait for the legal process. Within 48 hours, Sarah received notice of her termination, pending investigation, delivered by courier to her cell. Her keycards were deactivated, her company email suspended, her office contents boxed and placed in storage. 8 years of building the company, of 18-hour days and breakthrough innovations, gone with a single vote from men she'd thought were allies. Marcus filed for emergency custody of Emma the same day, citing Sarah's drug use and criminal behavior. The family court judge, Harold Morrison, golf buddy of Marcus's father, recipient of substantial campaign contributions from the Mitchell family, granted temporary custody immediately without even holding a hearing. The custody arrangement was designed to break her spirit incrementally, like a medieval torture device that tightened one click at a time. Sarah was allowed supervised visits only, 2 hours, twice a week, with a court-appointed observer taking notes on every interaction. The observer, Mrs. Dolores Winters, was a severe woman in her 60s who viewed Sarah with barely concealed disgust, her reports later painting normal maternal affection as emotional instability and every tear as inappropriate displays that upset the child. "Mommy, why can't you come home?" Emma asked during their first visit, held in a sterile room at the family services building that smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Her small face was confused and tearful. Her favorite dress, the purple one with unicorns that Sarah had bought for her 5th birthday, wrinkled as if hastily put on. "It's complicated, sweetheart, but I'm working on it. I promise I'm fighting to come home." The observer wrote something in her notebook, underlining it twice. Later, Sarah would learn that Mrs. Winters had reported this as making inappropriate promises to the child and potentially alienating father by implying conflict. Marcus's lawyer, William Patterson, was a shark in Armani who'd never lost a high-profile divorce in 30 years of practice. He moved with surgical precision, every joint account frozen within hours, every credit card canceled simultaneously, even Sarah's car lease terminated since it was technically a corporate vehicle registered to Marcus's company. She received notice of these actions via text message while sitting in her jail cell, each ping another cut in death by 1,000 cuts. Sarah's parents wired her money from their retirement savings, $30,000 that represented their entire emergency fund, accumulated over 40 years of her father's work as a high school principal and her mother's career as a nurse. She found a studio apartment in a building that reeked of mildew and broken dreams, where the elevator worked sporadically and gunshots were common enough that she learned to distinguish them from backfiring cars. It was 40 minutes from Emma's school, in a neighborhood where her BMW, before it was repossessed, would have been stripped within hours. The criminal case moved forward with mechanical efficiency. The prosecution, led by ADA Margaret Frost, a woman with political ambitions and connections to the Mitchell family, painted Sarah as a drug-dealing executive who'd used her company as a front for distribution. The cocaine in her car, they claimed, was just the tip of the iceberg. Mrs. Mitchell had access to international shipping channels through next-gen biotech, Frost argued in pretrial motions. She had the means, the opportunity, and clearly the moral flexibility to operate a sophisticated drug operation. Rachel fought back brilliantly, but every victory was Pyrrhic. When she proved the cocaine had no fingerprints from Sarah, the prosecution argued she'd worn gloves. When she demonstrated the financial irregularities in the embezzlement charges, they claimed Sarah was clever enough to cover her tracks. The media, fed carefully crafted leaks, portrayed Sarah as the executive who had it all and wanted more. Then came the doctor's testimony that shattered what remained of Sarah's reputation. Dr. Harrison, Sarah's obstetrician for 5 years, the man who'd delivered Emma, who'd held Sarah's hand through a miscarriage 2 years ago, sat in family court and stated with clinical detachment that Sarah had exhibited drug-seeking behavior and prenatal negligence. When Rachel pressed him during cross-examination, he couldn't meet Sarah's eyes, his gaze fixed on a point just over her left shoulder. She requested multiple prescriptions for pain medication. "I was concerned about addiction potential, especially given her pregnancy status. She became agitated when I refused, exhibited signs of withdrawal." It was a lie so blatant Sarah gasped aloud, the sound echoing in the courtroom. She'd refused pain medication even for severe morning sickness, had insisted on natural childbirth with Emma despite 36 hours of labor. But her medical records had been altered, digitally modified with timestamps that predated her arrest, making it impossible to prove tampering. Every request for epidural during Emma's birth was changed to request for oxycodone. Every notation about refusing pain medication was inverted. The mercury poisoning, when she tried to report it, was dismissed as unsubstantiated allegations from a desperate woman seeking to avoid responsibility. The lab that had tested the vitamins mysteriously lost the samples. Brooks's documentation was deemed inadmissible hearsay from an unlicensed investigator with a grudge against the system. Victoria, meanwhile, documented everything on social media with the skill of a professional propagandist. Standing by my man through difficult times, with sunset selfies at Sarah's former home, her arm around Marcus on the deck Sarah had designed. Emma's adjustment period, with photos of her daughter's bedroom, redecorated entirely in princess pink, every trace of the astronomy theme Sarah had carefully cultivated erased. New beginnings with her hand sporting a massive engagement ring, Sarah's engagement ring she realized with a sick twist in her stomach, reset with new stones and a different band. The comment sections were war zones where Sarah's reputation was murdered repeatedly. Poor Marcus, dealing with an addict wife while trying to protect his daughter. Victoria is so brave for taking on a ready-made family. Emma is lucky to have her. Sarah Mitchell should be in prison. Embezzlement and drug dealing. Throw away the key. The stress-triggered contractions at 28 weeks. Sarah drove herself to the emergency room in a decade-old Honda she'd bought with her parents' money, blood pressure spiking so high, the triage nurse immediately admitted her. She spent 3 days in the hospital, alone in a sterile room as nurses whispered about the embezzlement woman from the news, their conversations drifting through the thin curtains. Can you believe she showed up here? Like we're supposed to feel sorry for her? That poor little girl, at least she has her father. I heard she was high when they arrested her, probably high now, claiming it's pregnancy complications. The baby held on, but barely. Bed rest was ordered, but how could she rest when her world was cremating around her? She watched the ceiling of her studio apartment, counting water stains, feeling the baby's movements slow as her stress hormones flooded their shared system. Every kick was weaker than the last, and she wondered if Marcus's poison was winning, if he was going to succeed in destroying not just her, but the innocent life she carried. Rachel worked 18-hour days without billing a cent, filing motion after motion, trying to slow the avalanche. She found evidence of Marcus's affairs dating back 3 years, not just Victoria, but 2 others, a pattern of behavior that should have mattered in custody proceedings, but somehow didn't. Judge Morrison dismissed it as irrelevant to parenting capacity. Men have affairs, Morrison stated from the bench, his tone suggesting this was as natural as breathing. It doesn't make them unfit fathers. Mrs. Mitchell's criminal activities, however, directly endanger the child. Rachel Torres had always been brilliant, but brilliance alone wasn't what made her dangerous to Marcus Mitchell. It was her persistence, the kind that resembled water seeping into cracks, wearing stone down grain by grain until even the hardest surface split. Sarah had watched that persistence before. The way Rachel could track a lid for days without sleeping, her methodical way of asking questions that seemed harmless until they accumulated into something damning. This time, Rachel turned that focus onto Marcus, and for the first time in months, Sarah dared to believe there might be a way out. The first break came not from a courtroom filing or a high-priced investigator, but from a valet stand outside an upscale restaurant in Bellevue. Rachel had combed through hours of security footage, her eyes burning from the glow of the monitors, until there it was. Marcus stepping out of a black Mercedes, Victoria Sterling on his arm. The camera caught the moment clearly. Marcus adjusting his cufflinks, laughing at something Victoria said, and then slipping a small plastic bag of white powder into his palm before tucking it into his jacket. Rachel leaned forward in her chair, hard hammering. She froze the frame, zoomed in, printed copies. But footage alone was fragile. Defense attorneys could argue perspective, shadows, digital artifacts. She needed a witness. That's when she found Daniel Morgan. Daniel remembered everything. He remembered because Marcus had tipped him $500 in tow, a wad of bills so out of proportion to the usual valet tip that he'd taken a photo of the stack, half amused, half suspicious. He said it was his anniversary, Daniel testified in a deposition Rachel arranged. But he wasn't with his wife. His wife. She's been there before. She's nice. Always asks about my mom. The lady that night, blonde, expensive dress, cold. Miss Sarah listened to the deposition through a recording, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in months. Possibility. The idea that someone had finally seen Marcus for who he was and had proof lit a spark in her chest. That spark grew when Michael Brooks, Rachel's financial contact, delivered the second blow. He introduced them to Jennifer Walker, a quiet, methodical woman who worked at Marcus's bank. Jennifer had noticed irregularities in certain transfers, tiny discrepancies, always at odd hours, spread across accounts that were supposed to be dormant. Out of instinct and integrity, she had kept her own records, tucked away in a locked drawer. 17 shell companies, Jennifer explained over coffee in a nondescript diner. She pushed the papers across the table to Rachel and Sarah. The names changed, the registrations jumped from the Caymans to Belize to the Isle of Man. But the signatures, they match. And the endpoints are always the same. Accounts controlled by Marcus Mitchell and Victoria Sterling. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. $8 million. The number seemed obscene, not just for its size, but because she could trace every dollar back to her life, to the joint accounts she had thought were safe, to the profits of her company that she had once proudly reinvested, to the home equity she and Marcus had agreed to leave untouched. Every figure on the page was a piece of her trust siphoned away. "They gutted me," Sarah whispered. "While I was planning events, while I was raising Emma, they were stealing the foundation out from under me." Rachel squeezed her arm. "And now we can show it." The third piece came unexpectedly. Amy Rogers, a nurse who'd worked in medical records for over 15 years, asked Rachel for a private meeting. They met in the hospital cafeteria, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. Amy's voice shook, not from nerves but from anger. "Someone tampered with her records," she said, sliding over a stack of notes. 2 years' worth. It looks subtle if you don't know what you're looking for, like corrections, clerical fixes. But I keep parallel paper files. I've compared them. The digital versions have been altered systematically. "Altered how?" Rachel asked. "Lab results rewritten, diagnoses inserted, medications added to her history that she never took. Whoever did this knew exactly how to make it look legitimate." Amy leaned closer, her eyes fierce. "This isn't sloppy malpractice. This is deliberate fraud." Sarah sat frozen, hearing her life rewritten in real time. Records she'd trusted, documents that decided custody, credibility, her very freedom, had been forged. For the first time in months, Rachel's eyes burned not with exhaustion, but with triumph. "We can win this," she said. "Judge Hawthorne is taking over. Morrison's off the case after the complaints about his ties to the Mitchells. Patricia Hawthorne is tough, fair, incorruptible. She'll see the truth." For exactly 17 hours, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future. She walked through her tiny apartment and rearranged furniture as if Emma might come home. She bookmarked modest houses in safe neighborhoods, picturing gardens where Emma and the baby could play. She imagined Emma's laughter echoing again in a place that wasn't poisoned by Marcus's lies. She let herself hope. And hope, after so much darkness, was intoxicating. The letter arrived at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, hand-delivered by a process server who smirked like he already knew the devastation inside the envelope. Rachel's legal license was suspended, an anonymous ethics complaint resurrecting a 15-year-old technical violation she had already reported and resolved. "It's Marcus," Rachel said, calling Sarah through tears. "His father's on the State Bar Advisory Board. They're gutting me so they can gut you." Sarah held the phone to her ear, numb. She had believed the system could work, that truth could matter. But Marcus was always one step ahead, pulling levers she couldn't even see. The replacement attorney, David Summers, was the embodiment of mediocrity. Gray suit, gray tie, gray opinions. He charged fees Sarah's parents could barely cover with a home equity loan. His advice was worse. Take a settlement, accept supervised visits, admit guilt in exchange for leniency. Sarah stared at him across the polished conference table. "I didn't do what they say. Why would I admit it?" "Because it's the best deal you'll get," Summers replied flatly. "It can't get worse," Sarah whispered. She was wrong. The hearing unfolded like a play Marcus had scripted himself. His lawyers painted Sarah as unstable, addicted, dangerous. They twisted supervised visit reports into evidence of incompetence. They brought in a psychologist who had never met Emma, yet testified with confidence about the supposed damage Sarah had inflicted. And then Emma appeared on screen. The little girl sat in a brightly lit room, toys scattered carefully around her. She spoke softly, each word tinged with rehearsed precision. "Daddy takes better care of me. Victoria makes healthy dinners. Mommy was always sad. Sometimes she cried when she thought I wasn't looking." When asked if she missed her mother, Emma's face crumpled for the briefest second. "Yes, but Daddy says she's sick and needs to get better. He says if I'm good, maybe she can visit more." Sarah's heart shattered. She wanted to scream, to reach through the screen and hold her daughter, to tell her none of this was true. But her voice didn't matter here. Judge Morrison awarded Marcus full custody. Sarah was given 4 hours a month, supervised, contingent upon completing a drug rehabilitation program she didn't need and couldn't afford. Outside the courthouse, Sarah sat in her car, 32 weeks pregnant, the contractions already tightening like iron bands around her abdomen. She opened her phone and saw Victoria's Instagram Live. "Justice for Emma," Victoria beamed to an audience of tens of thousands. Protecting children from toxic environments is never easy, but it's worth it for their future. Hearts floated across the screen. Comments hailed her as brave, Marcus as strong, and Sarah, the mother who had given everything, was reduced to a villain in her own story. Her water broke in the courthouse parking lot at 4:17 p.m. Fluid soaked the seat, tinged green with meconium, an ominous sign. Pain tore through her body, relentless. She drove herself, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, running red lights, praying for someone to notice and help. No one did. The hospital lights blurred as the contractions overtook her. The baby came too quickly, too small. 3 pounds, 2 ounces, dark hair. Tiny fists clenched as though already fighting the world he'd been born into. His cry, thin, reedy, but fierce, echoed in Sarah's ears before the NICU doors closed and he was whisked away. She named him Luke, after her father, a man who had never known that his daughter would be framed, destroyed, and left to bring a child into the world alone. Marcus didn't come. Neither did Emma. The court order didn't even allow for a hospital visit. Sarah lay in recovery, hearing laughter and celebration from other rooms where families embraced new life. She stared at the ceiling, hollow and broken, while her son fought for breath 2 floors away. And in that silence, hope was gone, replaced not with despair, but with something colder. Sharper, a resolve forged in grief. On day 6 of Luke's NICU stay, Sarah learned 2 things at once. One, that a premature baby's chest can rise and fall like a hummingbird's wing and still keep going. And 2, that a 5-year-old can carry a world on a plastic tablet and never drop it. Michael Brooks slid into the family lounge as if he were just another exhausted parent. He wore a nondescript jacket, his face weathered in the way honesty leaves track marks. He set an encrypted flash drive on the Formica table between coffee cups and the forgotten jigsaw puzzle that every NICU family pretended they had time to finish. "Emma's been recording some," he said. Sarah didn't breathe so much as stop drowning. "What?" "The tablet you gave her at 4. She never stopped using it." He gestured like he was laying out a chessboard neither of them had realized they'd been playing. She learned the lock pattern by heart. Little star, big heart. She figured out the red button means record. And she remembered the cloud account you made for her art projects. She uploads there. Quiet, consistent. Sarah's mind skipped. Birthday cake with pink frosting, tiny hands smudged with marker, a proud voice saying, "Mommy, look, I drew our house." She had taught Emma to tap the camera icon. She had never imagined teaching her to survive with it. Brooks took a breath, his voice gentled, like gravel smoothed by rain. "Your daughter is brave in a way no 5-year-old should have to be. She's careful. She's methodical. I'm going to say it, she's your kid." Sarah laughed once, too sharp, then covered her mouth. "Show me." They moved to a corner by the vending machines where the televisions played cartoons on mute. Brooks pulled out a small laptop, queued up a folder labeled with stickers and emojis, rainbows, unicorns, a crooked heart. The first file opened to a tilted shot of carpet. Adult footsteps passed. Voices bled into the tiny microphone like radio through a storm. Marcus, on the phone in his study 3 days after Sarah's arrest, and the mercury is working perfectly. She's getting weaker. Sarah's hand moved without her permission, as if she could press the words back into silence. Brooks paused the playback and studied her face like a medic watching a wound for too much bleeding. "Don't protect me from it," Sarah said. "Let me hear." He hit play. More recordings. Emma's backpack sat on a kitchen chair while she pretended to color. Victoria laughed in a way Sarah used to think meant friendliness and now understood meant conquest. And then there was Harrison Mitchell's voice, oily as old money, confirming what the company had long denied. Records scrubbed, supply chains untraceable, profit over lives. Between files, there were little whispers. The tablet mic picked up Emma's soft commentary. "For mommy. Daddy is being mean. I want my real mommy back." Sarah pressed her palm to the cold table and steadied herself. How did she know when to record? "Because you taught her to notice," Brooks said simply, "but she designed the system." He flipped to a folder within a folder. Stickers again, now yellow stars. Emma's rules. The first video showed a dark hallway and Emma's face lit by the tablet glow. Tear tracks. Determination. "Rule 1 is yay," Emma whispered, sounding exactly like a kindergarten teacher playing spy. "Always press the red button before the mean talk starts." A second clip, Emma showing where she hid the tablet in her backpack, beneath crayons and a book so the lens peeked through the mesh and saw without being seen. Rule 2, don't let the grown-up see the red dot. A third clip, filmed in her closet, the door a sliver of safety and shadow. Rule 3, upload to the cloud when the Wi-Fi is strong. If the Wi-Fi is sleepy, try later. In one video, Emma placed the tablet under the dining room table and set a napkin like a little tent to hide the light. In another, she tucked it in the toy bin near the study, recording gaps under the door while Marcus made calls. She experimented on the couch armrest under the bench at the hotel lobby when Victoria took her to special brunch, in the cup holder of the car where Bluetooth caught the echo of speakerphone. She narrated the time and date in her tiny voice. "This is Monday after ballet. This is Saturday when Daddy wears golf hat." Emma had invented tags without knowing the word. She'd hold up the tablet and say, "For mommy, this one is kitchen," or "For mommy, this one is office." She used stickers as metadata. A unicorn meant the person was pretending to be nice. A dragon meant scary. A cloud meant call. A broken heart, only 3 files, meant I cried. Sarah listened to her daughter's system, wildflower cleverness growing in concrete, and thought, they underestimated us. Brooks didn't just bring audio, he brought structure. He had taken Emma's fragments and laid them end to end, building a timeline with the patience of a man who understood that justice is a mosaic. He showed Sarah an index, dates, locations, keywords. He had scrubbed the files for manipulation claims, checked metadata, preserved hashes, created read-only copies. He moved like a man who used to carry a badge and now carried something heavier, disgust. "This is enough to open every door that's been slammed in our faces," he said. "Pharmaceutical fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy, child endangerment. We submit it to the Bureau under protected witness protocols, and we protect Emma." "What about the restraining order?" Sarah asked. "They'll say I orchestrated it, that I used my child." "You didn't," Brooks said, "and we'll prove chain of custody. We'll show that Emma acted independently, but with child-safe intent, documenting her environment because she was scared. We'll let the facts speak." He ejected the flash drive and slid it to Sarah. It felt heavy as a live thing, power but also danger. "I've made 12 copies," he said, "in 12 places. If anyone touches you or Emma or me, every copy goes to the FBI, the DEA, the CDC, and the press at the same time." Sarah nodded, not because she accepted the plan, but because there was no other one. The FBI moved like a shadow that day. Special Agent Jennifer Coleman met them in a hospital conference room that still smelled faintly of whiteboard cleaner and coffee. She had the bearing of someone who'd argued with senators and won. She listened without interrupting. She asked precise questions. She never once looked at Sarah the way family court had, like she was a problem to be managed instead of a human to be protected. "We'll initiate a covert review," Coleman said. "I'll put it under the umbrella of a broader corporate crime task force. We won't wave this around. We'll build from it." Brooks slid across a binder he'd compiled. An index of Emma's files, a short memo explaining the tablet, Sarah's original cloud settings, the recovery logs. He'd even thought to include Emma's rules videos, explaining them as context for the child's consistent behavior. Coleman scanned, then looked up. "This is extraordinary." "It's a 5-year-old's courage," Sarah said. "We're just catching up." Coleman inclined her head. "We'll protect her." They planned protocols. No mention of Emma in official memos beyond juvenile witness. No direct interviews without a child advocate present. If the court tried to weaponize the recordings against Sarah, Coleman would file a sealed affidavit asserting federal interest in witness safety. "And you," Coleman said to Sarah, "need safe lodging." "I'm fine," Sarah lied. The words were automatic now, like a faulty reflex. Coleman didn't accept it. "We can place you in protective housing. If you place me, they know you're moving. We need quiet. I needed to be with Luke." Then, because truth felt like a relief valve, "I sleep in the garage. I shower here. I tell the nurses I'm at Ronald McDonald House." Coleman's eyes cooled with fury, not at Sarah, but at a system that lets mothers choose between shelter and their child's bedside. "We'll get you meal vouchers and a parking pass through a patient services fund," she said. "No paper trail to us." It was Amy Rogers who made it work. Amy was a NICU nurse with gel pens in her scrub pocket in the steady hands of a person who could thread a catheter through a vein the size of a hair. She had dark curls clipped back and shoes that squeaked softly on the polished floor. She was also the one who had noticed discrepancies in Sarah's medical chart weeks before. The subtle changes, the retroactive entries, the way an attending's signature looked traced. On a Tuesday when the monitors chirped like robotic birds, Amy leaned against the incubator wall and spoke without moving her lips much. "I keep a backup of all altered entries," she said, voice soft as a lullaby. "Hard copy. Offsite." Sarah blinked. "Why?" "Because babies die when records lie," Amy said simply, "and mothers go to jail." She introduced Sarah to the quiet ecosystem of the NICU, the volunteers who folded blankets and never asked questions, the social worker who knew which grant covered parking, the security guard who made sure Sarah's car was under the one functioning camera. Amy was not dramatic. She was competent. She was gentle with Luke and ruthless with the truth. When the FBI needed chain of custody statements for the altered records, Amy provided them. When they needed an extra set of eyes on Luke's chart, she flagged an entry entered after the fact but time-stamped earlier. When Sarah hadn't eaten in 16 hours, Amy put a sandwich into her hand and said, "This is not charity. And utait gimi already. This is scaffolding." It was Amy who whispered, "They will try to move you. If anyone comes without proper credentials, you don't go." It was Amy who taped a tiny paper star inside Luke's incubator, barely visible, so Sarah would know at a glance if someone had opened it without charting. It was Amy who made herself a target without ever using the word. The hits came anyway. Marcus's lawyers filed motions with the speed of a printer jam. They called Sarah a stalker, an unfit mother, a manipulator of children. They tried to suppress the recordings, called them illegal under state wiretap laws despite Emma being present for every conversation. Judge Morrison, whose bias was a rumor that moved through the courthouse like smoke, sided with Marcus on a preliminary basis. The restraining order tightened to a noose, 500 feet from Marcus, from Victoria, from Emma, except during supervised hours. Sarah stared at the paper and felt the way a building must feel when someone shuts off the water to its sprinklers. On Instagram, Victoria posted an announcement with sunset lighting and a white dress. "Building our empire, one blessing at a time." There was a staged ultrasound photo, a nursery board in sage and gold, a caption about redemption. The comments called her glowing, brave, inspirational. Sarah closed the app and returned the phone to her pocket like it was hot. She kept vigil at Luke's bedside. His weight ticked up ounce by ounce until the scale read 2 pounds 12, then 3, then stalled a while, then climbed again. Sarah learned to read the green lines on the monitor, which dips were fine and which meant nurses moved fast. She learned the tiny cough he made when he was too tired to cry. She learned that human skin to skin can regulate a baby's heart rate like a metronome. "Your sister loves you," she whispered into the soft fur of his hair. "She's building a bridge back to us." Sarah and Emma improvised together across a distance like prisoners tapping codes through walls. Emma sent drawings through her court-approved therapist that ended up in Sarah's hands. A house with 4 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. A small square labeled tablet with a red dot and a speech bubble. For Mommy. The therapist, bless her, never asked too many questions. She noted, child uses art to process stress. She did not mention that the child had organized a surveillance protocol better than most adults could conceive. Brooks kept Sarah updated in parking garage meetings that smelled of gasoline and rain. He moved like a man who had learned what went into the dark and what came out. He confirmed what Sarah felt in her bones when Amy didn't show up for her shift. Single-car collision, concrete barrier, no skid marks. Her apartment ransacked before the police got there. Laptop gone. External drives gone. The one file cabinet, the one with a lock, emptied. Sarah sat on the cement step beside the elevators and let the cold seep into her jeans until it found the place in her that had gone numb long ago. She didn't cry because crying felt too small. "Say it plain," she told Brooks. "They killed her," he said. "They made it look like an accident." The garage was quiet except for a distant horn. Sarah pressed her fingers to her eyes until she saw sparks. "Did they get everything?" "No," Brooks said, "because Amy was smart in the same direction you are. She gave me a copy 2 days ago. I didn't tell you because safety is sometimes the same thing as ignorance." He pulled a small envelope from his jacket. Inside was a key and a sticky note in Amy's handwriting. "For Sarah, babies deserve clean charts, a storage locker number, a locker city, a code." Sarah had to sit back against the wall. "She risked her job. She risked her life," Brooks said. He was not a man who said things for effect. He said them because not saying them would be untrue. They told Coleman. The agent's face went storm still. "We'll take custody of the locker," she said. "We'll document every paperclip. We'll move fast, and we'll honor her." They held a moment of silence in the hospital chapel that evening. Not because anything about this was holy, but because grief needs a room sometimes. Sarah lit a candle for a woman who had woven a safety net out of competence and was cut down for it. She whispered thank yous into wax and flame and air and promised things she didn't know how to deliver yet. "I will make this mean something. I will not let them write you out." Coleman's team expanded. What had been a trickle of evidence became a current. Amy's locker held printouts of altered charts with original versions clipped beneath an order. It held a spiral notebook of oddities, a nurse's word for red flags, medication entries that didn't match inventory, barcode scans that didn't align with shift timing, a penmanship switch midline. It held a list of names, doctors Amy trusted and those she did not, administrators who asked too many personal questions, a pharmacist who always fixed problems by rewriting history. Coleman connected those notes to corporate data Brooks had scraped and subpoenaed through friendly channels. The factory in Cambodia with no records. The shell distributors with P.O. boxes in Bangkok and Cebu. A quiet subsidiary registered in Delaware that updated its board the day after Sarah's arrest. Money that flowed like a river through 17 countries, each time changing color. "We're building a RICO case," Coleman told Sarah in the chapel again, because that room had become their war room. "This is not just Marcus. This is Harrison and whoever sits at his right hand. This is murder for profit and public endangerment, but it will not be fast." "I don't have fast," Sarah said. Her voice was steady not because she felt steady, but because the words had learned how to stand up. "Luke needs surgeries with clean anesthesia and trustworthy hands. Emma needs a home that isn't curated for social media." "We won't stop," Coleman said, "but I need you to survive long enough for the truth to matter." They negotiated safety by inches. Coleman arranged for an unmarked car to be present at all times near the Nice Hue entrance. She placed a plainclothes agent at the information desk for the next 2 weeks, posing as a facilities tech evaluating air filtration standards. She gave Sarah a number she could text that would ping 3 agents at once and a decoy number to use if she was forced to send a message under watch. Brooks taught Sarah counter-surveillance basics in the fluorescent light of the family lounge after midnight. How to mirror a phone so that if someone grabbed hers, the data would still live. How to check a car for loosely attached trackers. How to take photos of license plates without aiming the phone like a camera. He didn't turn Sarah into a spy. He turned her into a woman who could walk through a minefield without closing her eyes. Sarah, in return, kept showing up for her son. She learned how to change a diaper through portholes, how to nestle her chest around a tangle of wires, how to sing quietly enough not to alarm monitors. She answered questions from well-meaning volunteers with answers that were true, but not complete. "Are you staying nearby?" they'd ask. "Yes," she said. "Do you have family supporting you?" "Yes," she said, thinking of a nurse with gel pens and a man with a binder and an agent with a voice like a gavel. A small ritual bloomed. Every night before she left, Sarah placed her hand over Luke's incubator and whispered the same words. "We're not finished. We're not afraid. We're not alone." Emma's recordings did more than indict. They illuminated. They captured not only crime, but the texture of it. Victoria's voice when she thought only the right people were listening. Marcus's impatience when his father pressed him. The way he said collateral damage with the same tone he used to say Tuesday. They captured the silence between lines, the practiced calm of men who thought they were untouchable. They also captured Emma learning herself brave. In one clip, Victoria asked Emma to call her Mommy V, her voice papery sweet. Emma's whisper later, "No, I have a mommy." In another, Marcus promised Emma a pony if she stopped making videos, not realizing the pony he offered was proof of the videos he feared. Emma recorded a sound file titled "I Know," and then an 8-second burst of giggles that sounded like childhood trying to breathe under a door. Coleman's team built a child-friendly interview plan around those moments. A child advocate sat with Emma in a room painted blue with a shelf of stuffed animals. They didn't ask her to explain adult things. They asked her to talk about colors and sounds. "What did you do when you were scared?" the advocate asked. "I pressed the red button," Emma said as if reciting arithmetic. "What did you do when the Wi-Fi was sleepy?" "I tried later." "What did you want your mommy to know?" "That I know she's not bad," Emma said. "She's so brave." The advocate swallowed and nodded and made a note. Courage recorded, chain of custody, 5-year-old to cloud to mother's ally to federal agent, unbroken. The death threats didn't arrive as letters cut from magazines. They arrived as silence. A security guard transferred to another hospital without notice. A nurse Sarah didn't know tried to move Luke for a test that wasn't on the schedule, and Amy wasn't there to say no. The nurse left after Sarah said she wanted to see the order in the chart, her eyes cold in a way Sarah would remember later in place, someone who had been told the mother was difficult. Brooks started walking Sarah to the parking garage, not because she couldn't walk alone, but because a second set of eyes noticed different things. Twice, he pointed out men who weren't looking at their phones long enough to be normal. Once, he detoured them around a white van with magnetic company logos that peeled at the edges. He took pictures with the phone he never took out of his pocket. "They're probing," he said, "trying to see where the edges are." "What are our edges?" Sarah asked. "We don't have the luxury," he said. "We have lines." "What's the difference?" "Edges are where you fall off," he said. "Lines are what you won't cross." Sarah decided then that she wouldn't cross the line into fear so deep it made her unreliable to her children. She could be vigilant, she could be angry, she could be tired, but she could not be gone. When the court scheduled a hearing to consider suppressing the recordings and sanctioning Sarah for involving a juvenile, Coleman prepared a sealed brief that read like a fuse. She laid out the federal interest. She detailed the protective measures in place for a child witness. She appended excerpts, the least inflammatory, the clearest, so that any judge who read them would feel the room tilt. The hearing would still be a circus. Marcus's lawyers made sure of that. But Coleman's intervention kept the tent from catching fire. The judge allowed the recordings to be considered at a later date under seal and denied sanctions at this time. It was not victory, it was oxygen. That night, Sarah sat in the chapel by the electric candles and spoke to Amy like she was in the back row, hands folded, ready to return to her shift. They didn't kill the story, as she said. They killed you. I can't make that okay, but I can make it count. She stood, because standing is a kind of prayer too, and went back to the NICU to place her hand over her son's small chest and feel the rhythm that meant tomorrow was possible. On the way, she texted Brooks. How many copies now? He replied, more. She texted Coleman. What next? Coleman. We keep building, quietly, thoroughly. Sarah put her phone away and thought of Emma, the stickers and the rules, the closet confessions and the backpack lens, the giggles in the file called I Know. She imagined a future where her daughter's courage would be celebrated for what it was, not used to punish her mother. She imagined telling Luke the story of the sister who pressed the red button and saved them. She imagined, with a fierceness that surprised her, a court where the truth would matter more than the Mitchells' money. Soon, she whispered to Luke, soon is a word I don't trust anymore, but I trust us. The monitor hummed, the world moved. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, men made plans around mahogany tables. Inside this room, a baby breathed, a mother kept count, and a dead nurse's note stacked like bricks in a wall that would eventually hold. And in a house that used to be Sarah's and would someday be hers again, a little girl checked the Wi-Fi bars, pressed the red button, and said into the quiet, for Mommy. 6 weeks later, Luke finally strong enough to leave NICU, though still requiring oxygen support and feeding tubes. The custody battle resumed in Judge Patricia Hawthorne's courtroom. The change of venue felt like breathing clean air after months in a sulfur mine. Judge Hawthorne had a reputation for fairness, for seeing through manipulation, for protecting children above all else. Sarah had managed to secure Rachel's help behind the scenes, working with the uninspiring David Summers to present their case while Rachel fed them strategy from her forced exile. The courtroom was packed. The media had picked up the story, not the truth, but the scandal. Millionaire's wife falls from grace was the narrative, with sidebar stories about Victoria's pregnancy journey and Marcus's brave struggle as a single father. Sarah sat at the defendant's table looking exactly like what she was, a woman who'd lost 40 pounds from stress, who lived in Herker, who spent every moment either at the hospital or in court, fighting battles on multiple fronts with ammunition that dwindled daily. The DNA test had been Marcus's idea, a final humiliation, proving Sarah's infidelity, justifying everything he'd done. His lawyer, Patterson, had pushed for it with barely concealed glee. My client has reason to believe that the child born 8 weeks prematurely is not his biological offspring, Patterson had argued at the previous hearing. The timeline of conception corresponds with Mrs. Mitchell's increasingly erratic behavior. A DNA test will settle this matter definitively. Sarah had agreed immediately, which clearly surprised Marcus. He'd expected resistance, shame, and admission through avoidance. He didn't know that Sarah had documented every moment of their intimate life in her phone's calendar, a habit from their fertility struggles. She knew exactly when Luke was conceived, a rare night when Marcus had come home early, seemingly happy, wanting to reconnect. Now she wondered if he'd been celebrating some criminal success, if Luke had been conceived in the afterglow of planning someone's destruction. Sarah held Luke in a carrier against her chest, the baby sleeping fitfully, still so small at 4 pounds that he looked like a doll in his premature baby clothes that still hung loose. She'd lost 30 pounds since giving birth, stress and poverty carving her into sharp angles that made her look fragile, breakable. But her spine was straight, her eyes clear and focused. She had Emma's recordings backed up in 7 locations across 3 continents. The FBI was building their case with the methodical precision of engineers constructing a bridge. She just had to survive today. The court will now hear the results of the court-ordered paternity test, Judge Hawthorne announced, her voice carrying the gravity of the moment. This was the moment Sarah had collapsed before, but she knew better now. She'd eaten crackers and peanut butter from the food bank, but calories nonetheless. She'd hydrated, water from the hospital fountains, but water all the same. She'd taken iron supplements, bought with coins scrounged from her car's cup holders. She would stand for this. Victoria sat in the gallery, 5 months pregnant now, her bump artfully displayed in a designer maternity dress that cost more than most people's rent. She was live streaming again, phone held at an angle that captured her sympathetic expression while she supported Marcus through this difficult revelation. Her followers didn't know she'd spent the morning throwing up, not from morning sickness, but from the vodka she'd consumed the night before, the pressure of maintaining her perfect image driving her to drink in secret. Regarding the child Luke Mitchell, born 8 weeks premature, Judge Hawthorne read from the laboratory report, DNA analysis confirms with 99.9% certainty that Marcus Mitchell is the biological father. The courtroom rippled with whispers. Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again. Victoria's perfect smile faltered like a buffering video. They'd been so certain the mercury poisoning, the stress, the nights Sarah couldn't remember clearly would surely mean another man's child. They'd planned for this moment, had speeches prepared about forgiveness and moving forward, about Sarah's betrayal justifying Marcus's actions. Patterson recovered first, standing smoothly despite the shock evident in his voice. Your Honor, while this confirms paternity, it doesn't address the fundamental issues of Mrs. Mitchell's fitness as a parent. The criminal charges, the drug use, the instability. Counselor, Judge Hawthorne interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. I've reviewed the entire case file. I've also received sealed documents from the FBI regarding an ongoing investigation. While I cannot discuss the details of that investigation, I can say that this court has serious concerns about the validity of the evidence presented against Mrs. Mitchell. However, she continued, holding up a second envelope that Sarah didn't recognize, hadn't expected, this court has received additional evidence that requires immediate review. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. What now? What new destruction had Marcus orchestrated? Beside her, Summers looked confused, shuffling through his papers as if he'd missed something. In light of serious allegations regarding pharmaceutical fraud and attempted murder, the FBI has provided DNA evidence from an ongoing investigation. Judge Hawthorne's voice had taken on a different quality, harder, more dangerous. This evidence was collected pursuant to federal warrants and is admissible under exigent circumstances relating to child welfare. Patterson shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Your Honor, this is irregular. We haven't been notified. Sit down, counselor. The judge's voice brooked no argument. The safety of children is this court's primary concern. The FBI has indicated that this evidence directly relates to that safety. She opened the second envelope with deliberate slowness, the courtroom holding its collective breath. DNA analysis of substances found in Mrs. Sarah Mitchell's prenatal vitamins confirms contamination with methylmercury at toxic levels sufficient to cause severe birth defects and maternal injury. She paused, letting that sink in. The same analysis found DNA trace evidence on the contaminated bottles. That DNA matches Marcus Mitchell with 99.7% certainty. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were typing furiously on phones, the gallery buzzing with shocked conversations. Marcus stood, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, no words emerging. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne continued, raising her voice over the chaos, analysis of Victoria Sterling's recent pregnancy test confirms pregnancy. However, DNA analysis of fetal cells obtained through court-ordered amniocentesis reveals that the biological father is not Marcus Mitchell. Victoria's live stream was still running, capturing her face as it transformed from smug satisfaction to confusion to rage. Later, the clip would go viral, the exact moment a gold digger realized she'd been digging in the wrong mine. The biological father of Ms. Sterling's child, Judge Hawthorne announced, her voice cutting through the noise like a sword through silk, is Harrison Mitchell, Marcus Mitchell's father. The courtroom explosion that followed Judge Hawthorne's revelation would later be described by court reporters as the most dramatic scene they'd witnessed in decades of covering legal proceedings. Marcus stood so fast his chair toppled backward, the crack of wood against marble echoing like a gunshot. His face cycled through expressions like a slot machine spinning toward disaster, disbelief, rage, humiliation, and finally a terrible understanding. That's impossible. His voice cracked like an adolescent's, the polished executive facade shattering completely. My father would never. He's been married for 40 years. Victoria Sterling, 5 months pregnant and suddenly realizing her carefully constructed world was collapsing, stood slowly. Her live stream was still running, broadcasting to over 100,000 viewers who were watching the real-time destruction of what they'd thought was a fairy tale. Her beautiful face, always so carefully composed for cameras, twisted into something ugly and raw. "Your father," she said, her voice carrying across the stunned courtroom with perfect clarity, "pays better than you do." The admission hung in the air like a lit match over gasoline. Everyone seemed to lean forward simultaneously, drawn by the gravitational pull of unfolding disaster. Victoria's hand went to her pregnant belly, a gesture that had seemed protective moments before now appeared calculating. "You think you're so smart, Marcus?" Her laugh was bitter, sharp enough to draw blood. "Jamana, you think you were running the show? Your father's been funding me for 2 years. 2 years! You were just the public face, the puppet who thought he was pulling the strings. Everything, the affair, the timing, even getting pregnant, it was all his plan." "You're lying," Marcus whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Behind his eyes, connections were being made, patterns recognized, the terrible architecture of his betrayal becoming visible. Victoria turned to face the gallery, addressing the camera she knew was recording everything. Her followers, her audience, the million people who'd celebrated her romance were about to get the ultimate plot twist. "Harrison Mitchell approached me at a pharmaceutical conference in Miami 3 years ago. Not for sex, well, not just for sex, for business. He needed someone inside Marcus's life, someone to guide things in certain directions. The merger with Sterling Wellness, Harrison's idea, the offshore accounts, Harrison's design, the plan to destroy Sarah." She paused, savoring the moment. Harrison knew she was too smart, too independent. She would have figured out what the Mitchell empire really was. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising toward hysteria. "The drugs, you idiot," Victoria snapped. "The contaminated medications your father's been shipping to Asia and Africa for 20 years. The mercury your family puts in generics to cause side effects that require more expensive treatments. The entire pharmaceutical empire is built on poisoning people for profit. Your father knew Sarah would figure it out eventually. She's a biotech genius, not some trophy wife. So she had to go." Judge Hawthorne was frantically calling for order, but the truth was a flood that couldn't be contained. Victoria, perhaps realizing she was already destroyed, seemed determined to take everyone down with her. "The mercury in Sarah's vitamins? Harrison's special blend. He's been using it for decades. Your mother's dementia? Not natural. He's been poisoning her since you were in college, keeping her docile and confused. The same formula he gave me to give to you, Marcus." "Yeah, that's right. Those special vitamins that I've been giving you? The ones for optimal performance? Methylmercury, just like Sarah's, but in smaller doses. Just enough to make you aggressive, paranoid, easier to control." Marcus's legs gave out. He collapsed into his attorney's chair, Patterson trying to steady him while simultaneously attempting to stop the hemorrhaging of their case. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. This woman is clearly disturbed." "Oh, I have proof," Victoria said, pulling out her phone with the theatrical flair of someone who'd practiced this moment. "I've been recording Harrison for months. Every conversation, every transaction, every disgusting proposition. Did you know he has recordings of you too, Marcus? Cameras in your office, your car, your bedroom. He's been watching you your entire life, pulling strings, making you dance." She tapped her phone, and Harrison Mitchell's voice filled the courtroom through the speakers. "The boy is weak, always has been. Too much of his mother in him. But he's useful. Let him think he's in charge while we handle the real business. Once Sarah's eliminated and I have full control of both companies, we can dispose of him too. Make it look like a murder-suicide. Grieving husband can't live without his wife. The public will eat it up." The recording continued, Harrison describing in clinical detail how he'd murdered 3 business rivals over the years, how he'd poisoned his own brother to gain sole control of the company, how he'd been planning Marcus's destruction since the day he was born, backup plans for the son who might someday challenge him. FBI agents entered the courtroom, not just 2 or 3, but a full tactical team. Agent Coleman led them, her expression grim and satisfied. They weren't just there for Marcus. They surrounded Victoria too, and Patterson, who'd apparently been more than just a lawyer but an active participant in the conspiracy. Marcus Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, pharmaceutical fraud, and violations of the RICO Act, Coleman announced as agents cuffed him. He didn't resist, seemed barely conscious, the complete destruction of his worldview having short-circuited his ability to respond. Victoria Sterling, you're under arrest for the same charges, plus attempted murder of Sarah Mitchell and conspiracy to commit pharmaceutical fraud. Victoria laughed as they cuffed her, the sound unhinged. You think this ends with us? Harrison has judges, senators, FDA officials on his payroll. The entire system is infected. You're arresting symptoms, not the disease. As they led her past Sarah, Victoria stopped, the agents allowing a moment that seemed more like evidence gathering than compassion. You won, Victoria said, studying Sarah's gaunt face. But look at what winning cost you. Was it worth it? Sarah looked at Luke, sleeping against her chest, at the photo of Emma on her phone, at the truth finally exposed in all its grotesque detail. Every second, she replied. Judge Hawthorne, having restored order through sheer force of will and the threat of contempt charges for anyone who didn't sit down and shut up, addressed the courtroom. Given the evidence presented, this court makes the following immediate rulings. Full custody of both Emma and Luke Mitchell is awarded to Sarah Mitchell, effective immediately. All previous custody orders are vacated. The restraining orders against Mrs. Mitchell are dissolved. Furthermore, this court orders the immediate freezing of all Mitchell family assets pending federal investigation, with emergency support to be provided to Mrs. Mitchell and her children from state victims assistance funds. She looked directly at Sarah, and for the first time, Sarah saw emotion crack the judge's professional facade. Respect, sympathy, and something that might have been admiration. Mrs. Mitchell, on behalf of the state of Illinois, I apologize for the systematic failures that allowed this miscarriage of justice to continue for so long. This court will be recommending full restitution, though I understand no amount of money can restore what was taken from you. The judge then turned to the gallery, addressing the reporters and spectators who'd witnessed this unprecedented scene. What we've seen here today is not just the collapse of a marriage or a custody dispute. We've witnessed the exposure of systematic criminal enterprise that perverted our justice system, endangered children, and attempted to destroy an innocent woman who had the audacity to be intelligent and independent. Let this be a lesson to those who believe wealth and connection then place them above the law. Eventually, the truth surfaces. Eventually, justice prevails. Harrison Mitchell was arrested at his country club an hour later, pulled off the golf course in full view of his peers. The scene was captured by news helicopters. The 71-year-old patriarch of a pharmaceutical empire being led away in handcuffs, his golf partner stepping back as if crime might be contagious. The subsequent investigation revealed 300 deaths across Southeast Asia from contaminated medications, bribes totaling $50 million to FDA officials, and a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Marcus didn't speak as they let him out. He looked broken, hollow, finally understanding that he'd never been the player, always the pawn. His entire life had been a manipulation, from his education to his marriage to his affairs. Even his cruelty towards Sarah had been orchestrated, the mercury making him more aggressive, more paranoid, more willing to destroy the one person who'd actually loved him. The media explosion was immediate and overwhelming. Justice for Sarah trended globally within hours. Victoria's Instagram followers turned on her with the vicious glee of betrayed disciples, her comment sections becoming digital lynch mobs. The live stream of her confession and arrest was viewed 50 million times in the first 24 hours, becoming the most watched courtroom video in social media history. But Sarah wasn't watching the media circus. She was in a small room at the courthouse, holding Emma for the first time in 3 months. Her daughter had grown taller, thinner, her eyes holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. But when she saw her mother, when she understood that this was real, that she was coming home, Emma collapsed into Sarah's arms with a sound that seemed to come from her soul. "You came back," Emma whispered against her mother's neck. "I knew you would. I knew the recordings would help. Did you see them, Mommy? Did you see what I did?" "I saw them, baby," Sarah whispered back, her own tears finally coming. "You saved us. You saved us all." Luke, still in his carrier, made a small sound, not quite a cry, more an announcement of presence. Emma looked at her brother for the first time, her eyes wide with wonder. He's so small, she breathed. He's fighter, Sarah said, just like his sister. They sat there, the three of them, surrounded by FBI agents and social workers and the debris of destroyed lies. And for the first time in 6 months, Sarah felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Peace, where at? 6 months later, Sarah sat across from Marcus in federal prison. The visiting room was sterile, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of industrial disinfectant unable to mask the underlying odor of despair. Marcus had aged 10 years in 6 months, his hair completely gray now, his designer physique gone soft, his fingers nervously tapping against the metal table, a side effect, the doctor said, of mercury withdrawal. "Why did you agree to see me?" he asked, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. Sarah studied him, this stranger who'd been her husband, the father of her children, the architect of her near destruction. "Because Emma asked me to. She wants to know if any of it was real, if you ever loved us." "It was real, in the beginning." His voice broke. "Before my father got involved, before the money became everything. You were brilliant, Sarah, are brilliant." That terrified him. "So you tried to destroy me. I tried to control you. When that didn't work?" He shrugged, the gesture pathetic in his orange jumpsuit. "My father owned me, Sarah. The trust fund, the company, everything had strings. Victoria was one of those strings. The mercury, he's been poisoning my mother since I was in high school. Small doses, just enough to keep her compliant, confused. He told me about it when I turned 21, said it was a family tradition. His father did it to his mother. Control through chemistry." Sarah felt sick. Eleanor Mitchell had been moved to a specialized facility, the dementia slowly reversing now that the poisoning had stopped. But the damage was extensive. "And you continued the tradition." "I'm sorry." The words fell between them, worthless as counterfeit bills. "I know it means nothing, but I'm sorry." Sarah stood to leave, then paused. "The mercury didn't work, you know. Not really." Marcus looked confused. "I knew about the poisoning 3 months before I confronted you. I had the vitamins tested monthly. I took microdoses, enough to build evidence, not enough to harm the baby. Every symptom I showed you was calculated. Every moment of weakness was documented." His face went white. "You knew?" "I knew about Victoria from the first night. I knew about the offshore accounts, the pharmaceutical fraud, your father's involvement. Emma wasn't the only one recording. I have 18 months of evidence, Marcus. Every crime, every confession, every moment you thought you were winning. But you collapsed in court. Low blood sugar and stress, dramatic but harmless. The hospital confirmed it." Sarah smiled, not kindly. "You taught me something valuable, Marcus. Sometimes to win, you have to let them think you've lost." She walked to the door, then turned back. "Your father's trial starts next month. He's looking at life without parole. Your mother is recovering. She's agreed to testify." "Sarah, Emma asks about you sometimes. I tell her you're sick, getting help. When she's older, she can decide if she wants a relationship with you. But Luke will never know you exist." The door closed between them with finality. Sarah's new office overlooked the Pacific Ocean, designed with clean lines and sustainable materials that caught the morning light. Next-Gen Biotech had welcomed her back with a promotion and a partnership stake. The board, horrified by what had happened, implemented new protections for executives facing personal crises. Her first initiative was a program providing free genetic testing for contaminated medications in developing nations, a direct counter to everything the Mitchell Empire had represented. Emma was in therapy, processing the trauma with remarkable resilience. She'd started a journal encouraged by her therapist, writing letters to her future self about strength and truth. Her recordings had saved them, the 5-year-old who knew something was wrong and tried to help the only way she could. The tablet was now in FBI evidence, but Emma had a new one, used only for art and educational games. The recording function permanently disabled at her own request. "I don't want to record anymore, Mommy," she'd said. "I just want to be a kid." Luke, now 10 months old, crawled across the office floor while Sarah reviewed contracts. He was healthy, hitting every milestone. The mercury's effects apparently minimal thanks to Sarah's careful management. He was a happy baby, quick to laugh, his eyes the same blue as his father's. but holding none of the coldness. Rachel Torres had her license reinstated with a formal apology from the Bar Association. She now worked with Sarah, heading NextGen's legal department and advocating for women facing similar destruction. Together, they'd created a foundation using part of the settlement money from the Mitchell estate. Victoria Sterling was serving 8 years in minimum security, her Instagram account deleted, her influence evaporated. She'd testified against Harrison Mitchell in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealing decades of corporate crime. Her baby, a girl, had been placed for adoption immediately after birth. Victoria had signed away her rights without hesitation. Harrison Mitchell would die in prison. 3 weeks after his conviction, life without parole for murder, pharmaceutical fraud, and running a criminal enterprise. He was found dead in his cell. Official cause was heart attack, though conspiracy theories abounded. The pharmaceutical empire he'd built on poison was dismantled, assets liquidated to pay victims' families across 3 continents. Michael Brooks, the private investigator who'd worked for free when Sarah had nothing, now headed security for NextGen. His first act was installing a system that couldn't be compromised, even by executives. Sarah stood at her window, Luke on her hip, watching Emma play on the beach below during her lunch break from the company daycare. Her phone buzzed, another interview request, another woman seeking advice after facing similar destruction. The Phoenix Trust had helped 300 women in its first year, their stories variations on Sarah's theme, successful women systematically destroyed by threatened men. "You saved us, Mommy," Emma had said last week, unprompted, during bedtime. "We saved each other," Sarah corrected, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Will we always be safe now?" Sarah had thought about the question, about promises she couldn't make in an imperfect world. We'll always be smart, we'll always be strong, and we'll always have each other. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Sarah still woke at 3 a.m. sometimes, checking locks, reviewing security footage. Emma still had nightmares. Luke would grow up without a father. The scars were real, permanent, but they were free. As Luke babbled happily and Emma's laughter drifted up from the beach, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself a moment of complete, uncomplicated peace. She'd been broken, poisoned, nearly destroyed, but she'd never been defeated. The woman who'd collapsed in court was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, infinitely more dangerous to those who confuse kindness with weakness. The greatest revenge wasn't just survival, it was thriving in the truth of who you are, unbowed and unbroken. Sometimes the princess saves herself, sometimes she saves everyone else too, and sometimes, just sometimes, the dragon never saw her coming.